So with that, we're going to jump into our message. The message this week is on the heels of last week's message. And so last week, I'm going to recap what we talked about last week, but we're just going to hit it, and we're going to go straight through this message. In the original language, what's so funny back there? Oh, your notes. Yes. I was supposed to ask if you took notes, and she wants us to start doing pop quizzes. So be ready. It's a special request. That's not me. That's a special request. So we're gonna jump right in. So last week we started with a cool video and it was fun. Today we're just gonna jump right into the message because the section that we're looking at in the original language, it was so we're in 1 Peter. It's chapter 1. It's verse 3 through 12 is one sentence in the original language. It's 2 paragraphs in my Bible and a whole bunch of sentences in the English language. In Greek, it was one long sentence. So it's just one long run-on, one long sentence. And so we're going to jump right into it. But last week, to remind you, we talked about a couple of things. We talked about God's mercy, that it's God's mercy. It's what he withholds from us that allows us to be able to participate with him. And it's this God's mercy that starts this domino effect or this chain reaction of events that happens. There's God's mercy, which causes us to be born again, just like water baptism. We get dunked into the water and we're brought up with Christ. We're dead to the old self and we're alive in Christ. That we get born again. Because of the resurrection of Jesus, we're born into a living hope, that we have hope for the future, for what's going to happen, for what God is doing down the road. We have a living hope. And that is an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading. That the inheritance that we get from Jesus is kept in heaven. It's something that no one can ever take away from us. It's an awesome, awesome thing that we have through God. And it's for salvation. And that God is protecting you and your salvation for eternity. And that's what we have to look forward to. That while we go through suffering, we can see what God is doing at the end. And that's what we talked about last week. But the ultimate inheritance that we get is being able to walk with God in the cool of the garden. To get back to a relationship with God where we can walk and sit with him and be with him. That is the ultimate inheritance that we have. And so this one long sentence continues, and it picks up here in 1 Peter 1. It's going to be verse 6. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. The message today that I want to drive home to you is that suffering proves your authenticity with Christ. Suffering proves your authenticity with Christ. How authentic are you with Jesus? Suffering shows it. Now, suffering. This doesn't need a cute video at the beginning of it, right? I got your attention. What is suffering? What is God's character in suffering? How do we understand God's character in suffering? And what does it mean to go through a fire? And why does God put people through a fire? How do we understand this? First, I'm going to break suffering down into 3 categories, into 3 types of suffering. And it's really important because I've always, up until this week, have pretty much always lumped suffering, pain and suffering into one big thing. There's this big lump of pain and suffering that people struggle with. But I think as I started thinking about this text and thinking about what Peter's talking about and thinking about everyday life, I put it into 3 types of suffering. So the first one, this is Keith terminology, so give me a break. This isn't a commentary, but it's called dumb suffering. The first type of suffering is dumb suffering. Now, I call it dumb suffering because it's suffering that has been dumbed down, that it's barely suffering sometimes. That sometimes it's like, okay, we're going to be suffering because I have a flat tire. That's dumb suffering. Go blow up your tire, get your tire fixed, life, move on. It's okay. It's dumb, right? It's not a big deal. Like, don't get caught up in that. Or the temperature of your living room's not just right. Dumb suffering. That's not what Peter's talking about in this text. That's not what he's after. Then there's also what I would consider dumb suffering. That's probably more serious, but it's self-inflicted suffering. If you go to McDonald's every day and have a big old burger and a big old milkshake and a big old fries, and you eat that every day for a while, and you get type 2 diabetes, that's dumb suffering. Yeah, put the burger down, grab a salad instead, right? Like, there's suffering that happens. That's not the type of suffering that Peter's talking about in this text. It's dumb suffering. Now, there's dumb suffering, but then there's a second kind of suffering that I want to talk about, which is sin suffering. Now, sin suffering is more serious. This is a serious type of suffering, but it's not what Peter's talking about in this text either. So sin suffering is things that might happen to you or you do to other people, but it results in evil in this world. We talked about in Genesis, when the world gets turned upside down and evil is now in the world, that there's consequences of that. The first consequence that we see is death. The fact that there's death around us, the fact that people die, is suffering from evil, suffering from sin. There's also a lot of other sins that come from, or suffering that comes from sins, such as emotional abuse. That might be something that has been done to you. That might be something you do to someone else. That's a sin suffering. Sex trafficking, substance abuse, economic disparities. These are all things that come from sin. It's suffering because of sin. So these are more serious than your space heater going out in your living room, right? We can all grow up and say, yeah, that's not the suffering Peter's talking about. But this too isn't the kind of suffering that Peter's talking about. Remember who Peter's writing to. Peter's writing to a bunch of people who have been rejected. They've been totally, socially, economically rejected because they are Christians. They've been rejected because they're Christians. It's not a flat tire. It's not the living room's temperature. It's not gang violence down the street. It's not other sicknesses, cancer that happens to a family member. That's not the kind of suffering that Peter's writing to. The kind of suffering that these people are experiencing, the context of suffering that Peter is addressing are those who have said, I'm suffering because others know I love Jesus. Because other people know I love Jesus, I'm starting to suffer. A good example of this was my buddy Josh in Springfield. He's an awesome guy. He was a pastor, still is a pastor, did a church plant thing. Him and his wife decided that they would foster some kids. They wanted to foster some kids and adopt them. They went through all the paperwork, all the money, all the stuff you have to go through. The person who was assigned to their caseworker, or I don't know what the term is, but the person who was assigned to them to go through the fostering process and all of that was going through asking all the questions. And as soon as she said, what is your occupation? He said, a pastor. Things got a little tense. The knife could cut the atmosphere, right? All of a sudden there was something wrong. So they went on, you just keep moving. Like, I know what that's like, because sometimes I'll tell someone I'm a pastor, and then all of a sudden they start saying thee and thou, and King James starts coming out. You're like, it's okay, I speak English. So you kind of just keep going. So he just kept going through. Turned out to be 2 full years went by. Nothing. No foster opportunities, no adoption opportunities, nothing. Nothing happened. They kept praying. Finally, they had to keep escalating their case, and they were assigned a new person. But then in just a little bit, they were able to foster some children. That's what they wanted. They were suffering because of what he believed about Jesus. That's the kind of suffering that we face today, that we see around us, that Peter is addressing. And so this suffering, when you read the ESV version, it says that you've been grieved by various trials. And to prove that we're talking about suffering, to make sure you know that there's not some black box, but it is scripture that you can read it for yourself. If you look at the ESV, it says you've been grieved by various trials. NASB says you've been distressed by various trials. And NIV says had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. You can hear the context of what Peter's getting at. That the original language is that there's suffering, there's grieving, there's distress. And it's various, and there's all kinds of suffering. And these are sufferings because others know that you love Jesus. The kind of suffering we're talking about is because others know that you love Jesus. A modern day example would be a Muslim who comes to Christ in the Arab world. A lot of times for them, baptism isn't like, hey, I want to get baptized again to make sure I'm good with Jesus, which is how some people in America take water baptism. But for them, being water baptized and coming out and finding out about that is being shunned entirely by their family. Now, losing access to your family is horrible. That also means that you lose access to the economic situation that your family has. If they're farmers and they have land, you don't get that. If they're business people, they have oil, you don't get that. Whatever the economics is, whatever that you have, you've lost. And if you wanted to go trade and do other things down the street, it's often very hard because everyone knows, I'm not selling you anything. I'm not buying anything from you. The type of suffering that happens still in the Arab world when someone comes to Christ is what Peter is talking about. Often in America, we like books like Philippians a lot more than 1 Peter, right? Because we don't experience that like they did. But I want us to unpack why we don't experience that. And perhaps I can encourage you to want to experience some of the suffering. Are you ready? I'm going to push you. So, when you go through suffering because others know that you love Jesus, Peter says, your inheritance, which is walking with God in the cool of the day, when you have this inheritance, you rejoice in this. Now, for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials. You can rejoice in this. Be happy. Why? Well, first, it's for a little while. Now, for us, it might feel like forever. So I have an example, and we'll chalk this up to being a young preacher. But I have an example that kind of fits in one way and doesn't fit in another way. So I'm going to push you. You're going to have to think for yourself. So, anyone ever experienced food poisoning? Okay, that's right. A lot of people have experienced food poisoning. This is not the suffering Peter's talking about, but it makes one of the points that I think is really helpful for us. Several months ago, I had food poisoning. And I remember waking up in the middle of the night, and it was like, oh man, I didn't feel good. Run to the restroom, come back, lay down, like, okay. And then it's like, it starts coming faster and faster and faster. And then it's just like your stomach just hurts and you're just miserable. Like you're just hurting. You know what I'm talking about. You've experienced this. And it just feels like from 1 a.m. to 1:02 a.m. has been a week. And you've got to get to 8 o'clock before you can call the doctor. You know what I'm saying? Like it's just like forever. It just, when is this ever going to end? At 8, I can call the doctor. Okay. That's an example of what Peter's talking about. That even though we go through suffering, there's a point, there's 8 o'clock where we can talk to the doctor, where we can get some help. That's what it is when we get to heaven, when we get to be with Jesus. There's a point in time that's coming that this may be a little while. Now, for some people, that's from their new birth, from being baptized, all the way until they die. Their whole Christian life may be the suffering. But in regards to eternity, it's a little while. It's just a little bit. For the fact that you and I were created to live forever. That 10,000 years from now, 10 million years from now, 10 billion years from now, we'll still be here. It won't look like it does right now. This building probably won't be here. These trees won't be here. You will. You'll still be here. You'll still be around. You'll still be existing. In all of eternity, the suffering that you go through is a little while. For a little while. So what's the purpose of these trials? All kinds of various trials. Why do we do it? Why do we have to go through this? And how do we understand God's character? This is where the rubber meets the road. 1 Peter 1:7. So that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. It is really important that we understand the type of suffering that Peter is talking about. Genuine means, the English definition is to truly what one is said to be. Genuine is to truly what one is said to be. I thought of how often we have to authenticate our passwords, right? You said you're Keith and you have this Outlook account, but I'm not so sure. Go check your phone. Go check the other email account, right? We have to authenticate, like, you told me this thing, but I'm going to test you. I want you to go prove something different. You have to authenticate who you are. And we love authenticity, right? There is nothing in our world that's so filled with all kinds of surgeries and all kinds of things that you can do and all kinds of switching and changes and data things. There's nothing better than authenticity. And someone who is who they say they are. Someone who shows up in every aspect of their life as they are. That the work that Christ has been doing in you is on display, and it's the same in every context. So we needed to understand the type of suffering, because if we don't, we miss the character of God. The fact that our loved ones get cancer and die is not God putting the fire to them. That's not what Peter's talking about. It's not God passing them through the fire. That's not being tested in that way. Now, there's a lot that goes into suffering, and I can't unpack all of that today. But what I want us to do is to be careful that we understand exactly what Peter is talking about. That when you're going through the fire, when you're being tested by the fire, that fire has to do with the fact that other people know you're a Christian. Other people know your stance on Jesus. Therefore, you are having suffering. That's what Peter's talking about. It's very precise. Because if we don't, then all of a sudden, God's this guy upstairs like, oh, throw him this. Let's see how they respond. Throw him that. Let's see what happens. And he's a mean guy upstairs that's kind of enjoying the turmoil down here. But that is definitely not the case. People too often want to jump off the bandwagon of church because the temperature of the building is too warm or too cold. People want to get frustrated because they don't like the way that things are going. They don't understand why loved one ABC is having XYZ problem. The gamut of suffering we face. But where the rubber meets the road here in this text is when you're suffering because others know you love Jesus. Someone cuts you out of their life because you said, I love Jesus. Nope. You love Jesus? I'm not returning your phone calls. I don't want anything to do with you. I'm done. Wall. That's the kind of suffering. The person who acts immorally with the boss to get what the boss wants so that they get what they want, and you're not willing to participate in that you say, hey guys, this ain't right. What do you mean this ain't right? Get out of here. See if you ever get a raise. See if you get time off. See if you get what you want. You're going to do it our way or you're out of here. That's the type of suffering that Peter's talking about. A family member who cheats on the government in some way, who takes advantage of the government or takes advantage of some loophole and tries to get you to do it, and you can, no, I can't. Like, that's not what Jesus would do. I can't do that. And then they start hitting on you. They start pressing you. They start pushing you. They start trying to take advantage of you. That's the kind of suffering that needs to happen. That's the kind of suffering that is happening in this text. And what I want us to see is that I think too often in America, we're not suffering for Jesus the way that Peter's talking about, because we're not opening our mouths and we're not saying, I'm with Jesus. It's too easy to say, oh man, I'm suffering for Jesus. I had the fish sticker on my car and they cut me off. Oh, I'm suffering for Jesus. Right? That's where we land. Oh, I put something on social media and someone was mean. Oh, I'm suffering for Jesus. That's not what Peter's talking about. And what I want us to see is realize that this text has to do with suffering for Jesus when other people know. That we've said, hey, boss, no, I can't do that. That's not right. I'm more aligned with Jesus than I am with this, and God will provide for me. Your family member comes up and says, you ought to do this. You ought to take advantage of this thing. You ought to find this loophole. You ought to do this thing. You're like, I just don't think that's how Jesus would do it. Well, you ought to, hey, Jesus will take care of me. And they keep pushing you. You keep going. That's the kind of suffering we're talking about. And here, we got to keep going with the text. It's the genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold, that perishes though it's tested by fire. So this perishing is really important. God cares about you deeply. God experiences what you go through. The suffering that you endure, the suffering that you face, God knows about, and He cares about, and He loves you. He doesn't just, oh well, they'll be all right. They'll make it. It's not God. He's not a grumpy old man upstairs. He cares about you. He feels it. He understands what's going on. It's more precious than gold. Take all the gold in all the world, you're more precious. You are more precious to God than that, because gold perishes. Gold's not going to last forever. You are. You were created to last forever. God loves you. God's got a whole place up there where you walk on gold. It's no big deal for Him. You're more important than that. And also, gold goes through the fire. And here's the thing. You take a mineral rock and you put it through the fire, and a bunch of stuff is going to get burned off, right? A whole bunch of stuff is going to get burned off. And in some ways, that's us, right? We can apply this analogy to us, that there's all these things, this evil, this sin that's around me. But as I go through the fire, as I go through testing with God, that stuff gets burned off. It gets refined, and what's left is more pure. That's what goes forward. That's the benefit of going through this. The purpose of suffering is that junk gets burned off. But I want to warn you, as your pastor, the gold can melt too. And it's not fun. The gold can melt and be reshaped and reformed. And it hurts, and it's hard. But suffering for the sake of Jesus, suffering so that other people know what you think about Jesus, knocks that grit off the outside, and it begins to change and reform and refine who you are on the inside. Thus, enduring suffering for Christ sorts out those who are authentic from those who are false. If you're an authentic gold, if you're becoming more authentic with Jesus, you say, you know what, Jesus, you're more important than anything else, and you're like, I believe that as best I can, but I'm still struggling with that, and you go through those fires. Those who say, yeah, I love Jesus, come cheat on your taxes. Yeah, okay. They're not going to make it through the fire. The person who says, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do what Jesus, I'm going to trust Jesus. Oh man, I had to pay thousands of extra dollars. It cost my family XYZ. You live with those things. You live with those consequences. That is the fire burning off the stuff on the outside. That's the boss attacking you, the boss who won't give you a raise. You end up having to find a different job because you stood up for Jesus. God's in that. God's with you. That junk around you starts burning off, and what's on the inside gets more pure. But it can also melt. And it feels like everything's falling apart. It feels like everything is melting around you. It feels like you're barely holding on to anything. And yet God is taking that melted gold and reshaping it and refining it and turning it into what it was initially intended to be. 1 Peter 1:8 says, "Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory." Though you cannot see Jesus right now, though you have not seen Jesus right now, though you do see the pain and the suffering you're going through, though you do experience that, I don't see Jesus, I see the suffering. I have not seen Jesus, I continue to see the suffering. Though you see these things and you don't see this, if you stay faithful to God, he will richly bless you. This type of joy, this type of hope that we receive from going through these fires, even though if it's a little while, like being sick and you're waiting, and you're hoping to get through it, it refines you, and that gives you a joy that's unexpressible. A joy that abounds within you, a joy that makes you strong and happy. Well, how can this be? How can there be such joy? How can there be such joy in following Jesus like this, even though it's so hard? Because all the junk that people put on us, all the things that get layered on top of us, of the error markers we have to make, of the people we have to impress, of the things that we have to do, all of that gets burned away. That's not important. That's not important. That's not important. I don't care. That's not important. And all of a sudden you get left with, hey, it's me and Jesus. If it's me and Jesus, I'm okay. Because we're reborn in the resurrection of Jesus. We go down and die to our old selves and are born and raised with Jesus again. If Jesus can raise again, I can raise again with Jesus. I want it to be me and Jesus. I want it to be me and Jesus. Take everything. I want it to be me and Jesus. That gives you a joy inside that's refined. And here's the thing. It's inexpressible. My buddies and I who work on this message, the one is in Wisconsin and one is in Maine that we're walking through this section together with, we can't express it, we can't explain it, what's the preacher supposed to do? But it's inexpressible. You just have to do it. You just have to go through it. But God refines you and helps you. And then it goes to this, 1 Peter 1:9. Obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. The outcome, the end result, the finishing mark. The thing that we are working on is the salvation of our souls. So while you suffer for a little while, because people know that you love Jesus, while you suffer for a little while, you can get to the other side of this, and you can get to the point where you have the salvation of your soul. Now, the word soul has become to mean a lot of crazy things in English. What they're talking about here is the soul is everything about you. Everything. When God formed us and breathed into us and everything that we are, that is our soul. It's not just the spirit part against the flesh part. It's all of it. All of who you are. Your emotional state, your mental state, your physical state, your social state, all of that matters to God. And the salvation is not just getting through that, but what? Walking with God in the cool of the day. Being with Jesus again. And so when we go through these fires, and you can say, oh man, this is so difficult, and I messed this up before. I've screwed this up. I don't know what to do. You start back up at the chain reaction we talked about last week. You start with God's mercy. And it's God's mercy that gets us to be reborn again, which gives us a living hope, which gives us inheritance, which allows us to walk through suffering, which allows the junk around us to be burned off. And we say, okay, I screwed that up. I didn't do it the way I was supposed to do. I messed that all up. Now what? Go back in. Start with God's mercy. Start with God's mercy and go back through the chain again. Start with his mercy. Be reborn into a living hope with an inheritance that someday you get to be with Jesus and you go through that fire again. And just a little bit more is burned off. A little bit more is reshaped. A little bit more is done. And you just keep going through that process. And when you get it right, you have this newfound joy and hope that's inside of you. It's down inside your gut that, yes, I have been through some of the fire. I've been through some stuff, and it's still me and Jesus. What now, Satan? Come on. You can't kill me. What are you going to do? Kill me. I'm raised up with Jesus. Come on. You have a joy. You have a hope. You have a faith. You have a love in Jesus that allows you to get through that again. And you go through the chain one more time. You start with God's mercy. Reborn to living hope, into an inheritance, and you go through the fire again. And this is where the cycle continues to go over and over and over. And as we are disciple makers, as we are disciple people, we become disciples of Jesus who go through this process every day. Every day I want to get a little bit more like Jesus. That I'm willing to go through the suffering once again today, because suffering isn't a point-in-time thing. It's not like one day I decide, okay, I'm going to say no to this thing, and then it's gone. That's not how it works. It happens. Probably when you're 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. It happens when you're 12. It happens when you're 20, and you're 30, and you're 50, and you're 60, and you're 80. It just keeps happening over and over and over. There's these major things that you have to keep saying, God, I'm going to go through the suffering. I'm going to go through the fire again. I trust you. If at the end of the day it's me and Jesus, that's more important than anything else. And then that gives you this hope and this joy that you can continue. Suffering has a purpose. Suffering for Jesus, when other people know that you're suffering because of Jesus, can refine you into the person that God has created you to be. Each and every one of us have a gift, have a talent, have a special purpose in our life. And we can continue to be refined by God. No matter how old, no matter how young, no matter where we're at in life, we can continue to be refined by God and go through that knowing God will be with us. The worship team will come up. Let me pray for you. Father God, I thank you that we had this opportunity, that we had this time to learn from your word. God, I pray that you would take these words and your Holy Spirit would just magnify them in each and every one of us, God. That you would change us from the inside out. That you would help us to realize, God, that we don't bring anything to the table except for our faith and our love in you. And that we can trust you, God, to see us through. That you'd help us become authentic Christians. Help me, God, to be more authentic in every day, in every situation I face. I pray, God, that you would lead us, you would guide us, you would direct us. And you would encourage us, God, that we can just take this one day at a time, and that your mercy allows us to re-enter this process. God, I just pray that you would be with each and every person in this room and those who are joining us online, God. I just pray that you would walk us through your love. Change us, renew us, make us who you intended us to be. We thank you, we praise you, and love you in your name.